time I was here, I talked about what diesel emissions were. I talked about some of the sources of diesel emissions, and I showed you some of the preliminary work we did in measuring diesel particulate matter in the Portland area, and that there was some reason to be concerned. Today I'm going to talk to you about some more of the investigations we've been doing on diesel emissions in the Portland area with an EPA grant that we just received. We remain concerned, so there are some serious issues to be thinking about. Also, making measurements of diesel emissions is really hard because we're dealing with an unregulated pollutant that comes from sources that are economically very important, and our measurements may end up leading to regulation of those sources. So, not surprisingly, we don't get a lot of cooperation in making these measurements. So we've had to resort to a little bit of guerrilla science, and it's taken a team of guerrilla scientists to do this. So I want to call out Kirsten Saar. You want to stand up, Kirsten? She's the main graduate student in this work, and so I'm going to be talking about a lot of her work she used to do this. But there's been many graduate students involved, undergraduates, postdocs, other colleagues at Portland State, as well as Julie Fry, who's over here, another colleague. She's been a collaborator and a co-conspirator in all of this work here. So, where does diesel come from? So, as has been mentioned, diesel comes from a lot of heavy-duty equipment. So you can see from these images, these are pieces of equipment that are involved in moving heavy things. So diesel engines are very powerful, and as has been mentioned, they last a long time, so they are in our system for a long time. And they are involved in economically important activities. These are sectors that are important to our economy. So if we want to think about reducing diesel particulate matter in an environment to address health issues, we have to understand the level of emissions from each of these sources so we can target our regulatory system in efficient ways. So the first thing to look at is something called an emissions inventory. To look at where are these emissions coming from. So if this is from the National Emissions Inventory that one of our students, Lindsay Boyle, put together, looking at for the state of Oregon. So if we look at the state of Oregon, about 50% of diesel emissions comes from on-road vehicles. So that's trucks. Right? So if you look at the state of Oregon, we have a lot of highways and freeways coursing through our state. We also know, those of us who are Oregonians, that most of the population is in the Willamette Valley, and there's not too many people living in the rest of Oregon, but there are a lot of freeways there. The other half of the emissions for the state of Oregon are what we call the non-road vehicles. So that's construction equipment, the agricultural sector is big for the statewide emissions inventory, railroads, marine, commercial use of equipment, so about 50-50. If we look then at, compare it to Portland, the picture changes quite a bit. So instead of it being 50% on-road vehicles, it's 15% in the city of Portland. So the mix changes, and why that's really important is the regulations for diesel engines in trucking is a lot more strict, and we have registration for trucks. We don't necessarily have emissions testing, but at least we know how many trucks there are in the road. For non-road vehicles, we have a very poor inventory, although DEQ is developing one of non-road vehicles. We don't really know how old they are, what kind of engines they have, so it's a much more difficult source of emissions to quantify. The good news is that for the state of Oregon, there's around 1,700 tons per year of diesel particulate matter into the whole state. And it's about a third of that for the Portland area. Of course, you know what I'm getting to. The bad news is that 520 tons per year in the Portland area is being emitted into 6,700 square miles, which is less than 1/10 of the area of the state of Oregon, right? So the emissions are less, obviously, for the whole state, but they're concentrated in a much smaller area. And so this map here also shows you the population density in the city of Portland. So you can see that the population density itself is not uniform within the city. So this concentration of diesel particulate matter in the city of Portland gave rise to DEQ's concern about diesel in the city, and they set out to model the amount of diesel emissions that were going into our air and assess the concentrations. So this is another version of the map that Amy showed, one of my former graduate students, Meenakshi Rao, developed this map, and now she's working at DEQ. So this map shows, as Amy pointed out, the diesel particulate matter in the Portland metro area. And you can see if the benchmark concentration, the cancer benchmark, is 0.1 micrograms per cubic meter, pretty much everywhere in the Portland area is above that level. The other thing to notice here is it's not uniform in the city, right? So there's areas where it's a lot higher than other areas. But there are some surprising hotspots, right? So it's kind of odd that it's really high in the Hillsborough area, the west side. It's high downtown, that might be not surprising, but it's kind of quiet along 205. So this was their best guess, or not guess, but their best work. Again, they're dealing with poorly quantified sources in non-road emissions. And if we look at this map against the population density map, you can see why it's important to get this right, because we're looking at the concentrations of diesel particulate matter, and we want to understand the exposure of people to those concentrations. So it's really important to get this right. So is it true that the west side, Portland, the Hillsborough area, is really being exposed to that level of diesel particulate matter? Is downtown as high as it is? That's where a high density of people live. Is the east side relatively untouched compared to other parts of the city? So is that true? So that's why DEQ partnered with us to work on understanding and better quantifying diesel particulate matter for the Portland metro area. So we together applied for a grant to the EPA to do that work, to understand those really poorly characterized non-road sources, and then to do some measurements in a couple of communities to understand what their sources of diesel particulate matter were. So the two communities that we're going to be focused on are the Cully neighborhood and the Jade district. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about is our work around this first goal of the project, which is to improve understanding of diesel for these poorly characterized sources. So in particular, rail construction. I'm not going to show you marine, but some work on distribution centers. So you're going to be talking about these unregulated sources. So we've had to make these measurements in somewhat unconventional ways. So the first set of measurements I'm going to show you is for rail emissions. So Railroads, if you don't know this already, are really hard to regulate. They are a federal entity. California's been able to do something with rail, and we're a very special state. We're not so special. We have not been able to do too much with rail, but at least what we're trying to do is understand what the emissions are. So the federal government has done some work in improving the engines that go into newly manufactured locomotives. So if you look at so there's tier 0 to tier 4, so the tier 4 being the newest, and then we have 4 different pollutants there. So hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter. So if you look from tier 0 to tier 4, you can see you want tier 4 engines around, right? They're a lot less polluting, and California now is pushing the federal government to produce tier 5 engines, right? So we're putting our energy with California to get that done, because it'll show up in Oregon, 20, 30 years from now. But there's hope. Okay, but the rules are that, it's only the newly manufactured locomotives that get the newest engines, or if they remanufacture their engines, they have to go to the higher tier. But these engines last 30 to 40 years, so it's a very slow replacement process. We're interested in what tier of engines are operating in Portland, and also what's the activity level of railroads in the Portland area. So, we couldn't just call them and ask. I think Christians did try. She got some information. So again, this is guerrilla science method. So we put some equipment in a bicycle trailer and hung the tube down off a pedestrian bridge and measured the emissions as the trains went by. So we measured the train, the black carbon, which is a surrogate for diesel, particulate matter, train speed, and locomotive number. So with some sleuthing that Kirsten has become expert at, you can turn a locomotive number into what tier engine they have. There are people that keep track of this. It's very nice. Train buffs. So the first set of data is really interesting, is to look at the different tiers of engines. So this is many, many, many hours of sitting on pedestrian bridges, watching trains go by. So you can see we have all tiers of engines going into the Portland area, and the different train companies have different tiers of engines. And you notice that Union Pacific has tier 3 and 4. That's some of the cleaner engines. So it's interesting. So Amtrak, our federal government engines, are the lowest tier engines. And it gets worse there. I'm going to go to this. So why is Union Pacific different? So Union Pacific is responding to California and cleaning up their engines. So like a lot of air quality actions, we benefit from what California pushes. So this is another set of data. So I'm not going to go through the calculation, but we calculate the emissions, the black carbon emission factors from each of these engines as a function of speed and the engine, the train company. So you can see speed makes a difference. So the faster moving trains, which tend to be the Amtrak trains coming through the city, are the more highly polluting trains. So this is the kind of information we'll be using to informed the version 2.0 of the diesel model that DEQ will be developing in the future. But the other reason that this is important is that these train companies travel in different parts of the city. So it matters which company is operating where, because that will affect the level of exposure that people are getting. So it's not great to live by an Amtrak line. So again, this information will be used so we can do a better job of spatially characterizing where diesel emissions are being produced in the Portland area. Okay, so the next sector I want to talk to you about is construction. So construction, as people have mentioned, is a source, construction equipment, heavy-duty diesel engines, unregulated. They last a long time. They can be rebuilt over and over again. So they can put out a lot of diesel emissions. So this is from our preliminary work that we did a couple years ago, where I studied graduate student now just in downtown Portland, and he measured diesel particulate matter, black carbon, in several microenvironments around the Portland area. So you can see the big high point is for a downwind of a construction site that was going on right near Portland State. And so that level, that 6 micrograms per cubic meter, is to be compared to 0.1, which is the cancer benchmark. So it's not constant, that level. I mean, construction comes and goes, but that diesel particulate matter from construction sites goes into our environment. It's diluted, but it hangs around in our OC. So it elevates those kinds of sources, keeps it high throughout our city. So you can see, even in the park blocks, the levels are higher than just filtered clean air. So that's just our Portland background of diesel particulate matter is higher than the benchmark. Okay, so for this phase, we were having a hard time finding a construction site that would allow us to install our equipment and monitor it continuously, so we had to do some guerrilla science. Julie identified a construction site that was just getting started, and we kind of jumped on that. So this is, anybody recognize this? Yeah, it's the Ritz-Carlton site downtown. So we did a couple of things. So we're monitoring this with video. So I'm going to show you some video here in a second. And very painfully, we are going around with the buggy, with the equipment, and measuring the black carbon coming from that site at various times of the day and under different conditions, just to start to characterize how much is coming from a construction site. The variety of diesel equipment that operates on a site. So over the course of the day, there's probably a dozen different types of equipment operating on the site. The other thing that's really interesting is so in this picture you don't see it, but a lot of trucks going onto the site. So on that video you can see probably a dozen cement trucks coming and going and unloading onto the site. So construction, especially these big construction operations, have kind of two different sources of diesel emissions. There's the diesel emissions on the site, and then it's an attractor for all sorts of trucks coming to the site, and coming and leaving, coming and leaving, coming and leaving. So there's a lot of emissions associated with that site. So what we did was make measurements before construction started in the morning, so right before. So thanks to those of you that did that. Early morning, 6 in the morning. Went out there before the 7 o'clock construction started. We measured during the weekend when there's no construction happening, and then during construction activity. So weekend without construction, so the black carbon The black carbon levels are kind of the background levels that we saw on the previous slide, and just the Portland background levels of black carbon. So that's around the construction site. And then right before the construction starts, so they're out there at 6 in the morning, so you can see, so they're walking from PS2 with the instrument on to the construction site. So you can see some things perking up, so there's trucks starting to operate in the area. And so you can see some black carbon just showing up. And then when we have construction, we have it looks like that. So we have a very clear signal of the black carbon, not surprisingly, from the construction activity. So if we zoom in here on the construction activity, we can see, so the GPS, it gets a little wonky when we're in that kind of urban canyon, so it's the routes aren't exact, so that's why we look like we're actually in the construction site. But you can see that the effect of the construction, travels away from the construction site. So it's not isolated, it wouldn't be, right? It would be dispersion, so away from that construction site. So it gets up to some of the highest levels of 24,000 micrograms per cubic meter. So again, remember the benchmark was 0.1. Or no, sorry. These units, it's 100.
Okay.
100.
That's slightly better.
100 versus 20. So this, that's, honestly, I'm not sure the instrument is working at 24. Those are some of the high points. But we're probably looking at 6,000 to 10,000 in terms of an average around that area from that impact. So this is based on somewhat, maybe a week or so, several days averaged together, but the construction is continuing to ramp up. So what we plan on doing with this data is not just looking at this site, but looking at a variety of sites, so that we can get an assessment of the size of construction activity, the amount of construction activity, and the relative impact in terms of diesel particulate matter. And what we want to do is use that data to add more value to this permit finder that Amy was talking about. So this right now is set up where these symbols, the size of the symbols are based on the size of the projects, right? But what we're going to do is then add to this and provide some indication of the diesel impact of these construction projects. So you're going to be able to look at that as well from this. Okay. So the final thing that we've probably done the least work on so far is looking at distribution centers. So distribution centers are these kind of the modern logistics, right, where you have all this stuff arriving at this distribution center, and then all of the cargo, freight trains arrive with all this cargo, and then it gets distributed out to the stores or to your homes every time you press that Amazon button. So, Kirsten did a quick scan of some distribution centers in the metro area. So those are those black squares on this map, and then you have the freeway traffic counts there. So what we're trying to do is, the freeway traffic, the traffic counts of trucks don't take into account that the trucks are going to these distribution centers, right? So there's nothing measuring that travel to the distribution center. So what we're trying to do in these set of measurements is trying to get a handle on the amount of trucks that are going to a distribution center and the impact on the diesel emissions. So we looked at three different distribution centers in the area. We didn't didn't measure black carbon, we measured something called nitrogen dioxide, which is associated with black carbon. And what you can see here is so here's a distribution center, here's a neighborhood. So in the neighborhood, away from the distribution center, we have kind of background levels of air quality. But then near it, we have some impact from the trucks. So eventually, we'll be turning that into an assessment of black carbon, but you just want to get a sense of just the general impact from the trucks from that. So this tells us that trucks are really having an impact from their activities at distribution centers. Okay, so that's our research to date on diesel emissions in the Portland area. I just want to remind you, Amy has mentioned this already, why we care about diesel particulate matter. You know, the first reason that people have cared about diesel particulate matter is that it causes cancer. There's been a lot of work, toxicological work, that shows that diesel emissions are a source, are mutagenic and carcinogenic. So Oregon and California have established cancer benchmarks for diesel particulate matter. But I also want to point out that more recently there is epidemiological research associating black carbon with not cancer but asthma incidence and other lung function problems associated with specifically the diesel fraction of particulate matter. So we can see, so this is a study in the Bronx, and we did some work at Tubman Middle School. So Tubman Middle School, if you're not familiar with it, is just downwind, like 50 feet away from I-5 north, so a very heavily trafficked freeway. The levels of black carbon we saw there is comparable to the Bronx. So the effect that we would see at the Bronx, we would see similar effects if these kids were breathing that air. Now, fortunately, PPS stepped up based on this work and installed very state-of-the-art air cleaning. So we have, so that's a good thing. Another reason, if health doesn't do it for you in terms of thinking about cleaning up diesel, another important impact of diesel is that it's a climate forcer. So it's a climate forcer, it's only second to carbon dioxide in terms of contributing to climate warming. You know, a lot of that black carbon globally is coming from the non-industrialized world, where we're looking at biomass burning, agricultural practices. But in the industrialized world, we're emitting black carbon through, you know, these diesel engines and other sources, and it's adding to warming, probably not as much as these other sources globally. But what it does do, and this has been shown, is that North American emissions of black carbon, so that's, you know, diesel soot is among the black carbon, ends up traveling to the Arctic. So, and it adds to the graying of the snow and reduces the albedo of snow, and it accelerates the melting of snow in the Arctic. So that's another good reason to care about diesel. Okay, so